This story happened about 7 months ago. It was a cold winter day. Everyone in our house was outside but my mom. She was cooking and realized there weren't some ingredients, so she left for the grocery store. She didn't go more than 100 meters from the house when the car got stuck in the snow. Being alone, it would be impossible for her to get the car out. While she was having car trouble, these two men were collecting bottles from people's recycling bins in the neighborhood. They were both wearing cheap clothing. One was skinny, had a sharp and long face with pimples. The other one was fat with an elliptical face more than a circular one. At first, they just watched my mom circle her car and try to move some snow as best she could with her gloves. After a while, they offered to help push the car from behind while she tried to drive it out. In return, they asked that she give them $5 in cash. They helped my mom push the car out of the snow, and she was very thankful. Unfortunately, she didn't have cash on hand, and it would be an inconvenience to return to the house for $5. So she pointed out her house to them, which wasn't too far off from the place she got stuck, and told them to come by another day to collect their money. They were slightly disappointed and said they would return, but she ended up giving them a ride to the bottle depot almost 20 minutes away from our house. They could have easily have forced my mom towards any direction that they had wanted, as they sat behind my mom in the back seats. That night around 11:30, my sister was sleeping on the sofa downstairs. Someone started ringing the bell, and we all thought it was odd as we were expecting no one. I was the first one to go downstairs, and realized there were two men at the front door that looked somewhat drunk. They told me through the door that my mom owed them $5. By then my mom had come downstairs too, and she did say that yes, she owed them $5 for helping her earlier in the day. My mom kept telling me to open the door, but something about these guys made me feel a bit weird, so I refused to open the door, and told them to come by the next day. However, once they saw my sister on the couch in the midst of this conversation, they totally started ignoring talking to me, and started calling out to my sister, and even banging on the door with their fists. They kept saying hey and hey to her while hitting the front door. I ended up calling the cops on them and took the phone right near the door so they realized I was. They ended up leaving, but what's odd is that during the time they were at the door, their car was on outside. From the way they behaved, it seemed like they wanted more than $5 that day. Maybe to rob us, or worse. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, they released on the news that two men were arrested for aggravated rape and assault of a young teenage girl. Around 11:30 at night, two men approached the teenage girl standing alone at a bus stop right near our house. They hit her and forced her into an alley right near the bus stop, and they raped her there. After raping her, they coerced her to walk 20 minutes from our community into a neighboring one, and they forced her into their basement. The men were brothers, and they proceeded to rape and beat this teenage girl repeatedly for the remainder of the night until early morning. Somehow, she got a chance to escape. They had left her alone for a bit. She snuck upstairs and ran out the front door and sought help a little ways off at a neighbor's house. The two brothers, 25 and 27, were arrested and will face prison sentences for rape and assault. During the entire ordeal, apparently their dad was sleeping upstairs without knowing that a girl was being raped and beaten downstairs throughout the night and early morning of Saturday. A bit hard to believe, but apparently the cops believe him, or they didn't have the evidence to prove otherwise. Thank God they did nothing to my mom that day. Hopefully that teenage girl recovers from her ordeal, and hopefully these two rapists are not released soon. I am a recent high school graduate who is working full-time at a novelty shop in Florida for the summer. We sell comic books, video games, horror movies, sports memorabilia, wrestling shirts, movies, posters, etc. Essentially everything pop culture related and more. For the record, I'm 5'3", 110 pounds, blonde, and a huge dork. I think that's why most people feel comfortable with me. Most of our customers are regulars, who I get along with very well. And up until this encounter, I never had a reason to worry about my safety. Though I worked alone on this day, we were located on the strip downtown with lots of traffic and police regularly patrolling the area. All this started last week when a new customer entered the store. He was about 6'4", 240 pounds of rock-solid muscle, no doubt a very intimidating guy. The first red flag was as soon as he entered, he stood in the doorway for about 20 seconds with what I can only describe as a defensive position. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands out, crouched down, menacing eyes staring at me. I was very concerned, but I tried to make the conversation with him anyway, to lighten the obviously uncomfortable mood. He moves slowly from side to side and walks closer to me in a predator-type way. "Hi there, can I help you find something?" "Nah, I'm good, just looking for some wrestling DVDs. We've got plenty right on the wall over here." I guide him to the wall beside me, and he walks up, still staring at me with an evil, menacing glare on his face. Very cold and threatening. "I'm training to be a pro wrestler, and I need some tapes to study." "Tell me, Cameron." Name tag. Ugh. "Do you like to submit?" "Excuse me?" I heard him correctly, and at this point my heart starts pounding in my chest. Judging by his physique, I did not doubt that he was going to pro wrestling school for a second. "I see you're a very small woman. What do you weigh, 110 pounds? Again, I am very petite, and I look like a toddler next to this guy. "Sir, with all due respect, that is none of your business. I'd be happy to ring you up." "I like small girls. They're easy to control and dominate. You're just my type." He cracks his knuckles, looks to the wall, grabs a bunch of wrestling DVDs, and shoves them all on the counter in front of me. I quickly get behind the counter and ring everything up, ignoring his comments. All I wanted to do was get him out of the store so I could call my boss and let him know what was happening. Throughout this process, his eyes never leave me, and he leans forward, sniffing my hair. Vanilla, my favorite. You're a very pretty girl, Cameron." "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I bag up his DVDs and hand them over while he just stares at me, placing both hands on the counter. He leans forward. "I will make you submit, and then you'll be mine." Before things could escalate, which I'm entirely sure they would have, 2 customers entered the store and began to browse around. Thankfully, this seemed to distract his train of thought and deter him from doing anything. He shoots both customers a glare, turns back around to face me, and whispers, "I'll be back for you." He grabs the bag and leaves the store. I start crying, as this was very overwhelming, and I have never experienced anything like this before. The customers, both knowing something was off, asked me what just happened and if I was alright. Seconds later, I was on the phone with the cops, to which they rushed over and took a report. Unfortunately, there was not much they could do, as I did not get his name or anything about him. The next day, I was working again, trying to seemingly move on and forget this occurrence. Things were normal as always. I was folding clothing and sorting out the to-do list for the day, until I turned around one moment, and he was right in front of the window glaring at me. I screamed, ran to the phone, and called the cops, but he had run off by the time they arrived. I hope I never encounter this man again in my life. This happened when I was in 7th grade. Our teacher had left the room to photocopy some papers and left us unattended. Not 30 seconds after she left, a woman in a nun outfit came out of a closet that was temporarily placed in the hallway outside our door. Me and my friend saw her coming out of the closet firsthand. The nun lady was so old, her face looked like leather. Her teeth looked like yellowing wood. The clothes she wore looked musty and old, and the look on her face, pure insanity. She proceeded to walk out of the closet into our classroom and stand at the front. There was a 30-second awkward silence where she took us all in. Then she spoke. She started rambling on about the benefits of church, how our generation is so filthy, and that she wants to change us. We were all frozen with fear. I remember the teacher coming back into the classroom and being frozen in fear just like the rest of us. She told the nun to get the hell out of my classroom. Before the nun left, she shouted some weird word that was either a different language or pure gibberish. She pulled out a huge bag of candy from underneath her dress and threw it everywhere before she staggered off. As soon as she left, the teacher began making phone calls, while the rest of us whispered to each other about the whole event. I remember 2 cops coming in and questioning some of the students about what happened. I'm not sure if the lady was ever caught. This happened about a decade ago, when I was 10 years old. I hung around my friend's apartment complex, where we'd play baseball or manhunt, the usual 10-year-old pastimes. When I had this incident, I was with my best friends Ashton, Martin, and Joshua. So, the way the place is set up is there are 4 apartment buildings, and it's bordered by metal gates so no one can come in without a key. I remember my friends and I were playing Pokemon when we started hearing a woman's screams coming from nearby. When we looked around, we noticed that it was coming from the other side of the gates. We saw a black Honda Civic, and the doors that were facing us were wide open. There was a woman with 3 other men, 2 in the front, while the last man was in the back with the woman. They were arguing, and she was screaming at him. My friends dismissed it as a couple arguing and pretended not to notice. However, the screaming quickly turned into crying and pleading, so we got closer to the car to see what was going on. It was horrifying to hear a woman screaming, "Let go of me," and crying out for help while getting punched in the face by a man. It quickly became clear that they weren't a couple and that she was likely dragged into that car. We all grasped the severity of the situation, but being 10 years old and standing on the other side of the gate, we were powerless to stop them. Martin and Josh ran to the security office to tell them what was going on, while Ashton and I stayed behind to make sure to see what direction they were going if they drove off before security came. After another minute or so of watching her struggle, Ashton and I tried to yell at him to stop and told him that we were calling the police. In hindsight, that was definitely not the brightest thing to have done, because they just closed the doors and drove off. I remember as they drove off, the man in the shotgun seat stared into my soul. He had such a demonic grin on his face, a grin that let us know that they were getting away and that they were taking the woman with them. But that wasn't all. There was something even more sinister about that smile, almost as if he were saying that there was more horror to come. To whom, I had no idea. We were paralyzed by that stare, so much so that we forgot to take down the license plate. It was the most horrific expression I had ever seen. By the time the security had arrived, they were gone. Cops were called, and my friends and I went home because we were too freaked out to hang around outside. This happened around June, so my friends and I hung around after school pretty late before going home. Long enough where a lot of the teachers' cars in the parking lot would leave before we did. We were so familiar with the cars, and in what order the cars would make their way out of the parking lot. Ashton and I would hang around even later. We always walked around and just talked. That was the kind of bond him and I had. Now fast forward from the incident a couple weeks. Ashton and I were by the jungle gym and noticed one of the cars were parked in a different spot from where it usually was. To us this seemed odd because we had noticed the car sitting there for days, but it was a lot closer to us than usual. Also, we thought all the teachers were given specific parking spots, so this stood out to us. When we took a closer look at the car, our hearts sank to our stomachs. It was the same car from the incident a couple weeks earlier. The same black Civic, and it had the same man with that grin and his buddy in the driver's seat. They were staring at us, and they were so close. This man had figured out which school I went to and had waited there and watched us for God knows how long. The realization that this man had been watching and studying me nearly made me break into the fetal position. I was almost completely overcome by shock and fear. Ashton tried holding me up and kept telling me to keep my composure. Did this man follow us to our houses? What if he'd watched us on our streets, too? As soon as our eyes met, the man made his way out of his car, and Ashton and I bolted the opposite direction, running for our lives. Holy crap, this guy ran fast because he was gaining more and more ground on us. I remember the scream Ashton let out when the creep grabbed hold of his backpack. It was ear-piercing. You could hear the panic and dread in his voice. I don't know how he was so agile, but he quickly let his arms through the holes of the straps, abandoned the bag, and continued running. What happened next was just a stroke of luck. A couple of fathers entered the property with their children and saw us running towards them. We didn't even make it 20 feet to them, but they were immediately able to tell something was wrong, probably by the looks on our faces and how frantically we were running. As soon as the man noticed the other two men, he turned around and made a beeline back to his car and drove off. Again, cops were called, and we had told them everything about what had happened with them. From then on, we had a curfew. The scariest part of all this is the fact that he had been stalking us, and to what extent, we have no idea. That evil grin still haunts me 10 years later. So, man in the black Civic, let's not meet. About a year ago, my mom and I were looking at stuff in the jewelry aisle of Walmart, trying to find cute stuff for dirt cheap as usual. My mother is frugal and has raised me to be so as well. Anyway, we were looking for stuff and rifling through the earrings at this point when my mom whispers, "Great, there he is." I would like to take time here to give you the backstory she gave me whilst whispering. The guy, we'll call him Michigan after the blue and yellow sports hat he always wears, is obviously messed up. He's the kind of messed up you can see in the facial regions. You could tell he was born with it. Anyway, he had been doing this for months before I met him. He'd walk circles around my mom and stare. He'd even follow her around the store. My dad had told my mom he was ready to hurt the guy, so my mom stopped taking my dad to Walmart. He drives a semi-truck most of the week, so she'd go on the weekdays when he wasn't home. It's an important point that my brother is mentally handicapped as well. I looked over at Michigan and saw how messed up he was and that he was touching himself. Having the experience I've had, and not liking what might be his intentions, I stared at him long and hard and with hatred. He walked away and he went back to browsing, but it didn't last long. Again, behind the jewelry counter he stood, touching himself. He started to walk toward my mom, and I took her cart and moved it between him and her. He left the store and we finished shopping. About a month later, we went shopping for groceries, and my brother was there. Michigan showed up, and I whispered, "He's here," to my mom. My brother overheard it and inquired, so I told him, what could possibly happen, right? My brother happened. In what was honestly the only good series of events involving my brother in 9 years, he got anxious and stared at the guy a while. Michigan walked away uncomfortably. When Michigan came back, we had managed to get through a few aisles, and hilarity ensued. My brother saw him and said, "Let's see how he likes being watched." He stared at Michigan and he left again, this time pursued by my brother, who stalked him throughout the store for a whole hour. It was Walmart-sponsored Creeper vs. Creeper Stalkathon. My mom and I were laughing so hard. My brother had finally stalked the guy to the point that he left the store. My mom hasn't seen him since, but I have. I was working at the Dairy Queen not far from the Walmart, and one day the guy walks in. I'm making ice cream, and I spot him over the counter. He's getting a blizzard. I make the ice cream as he sits down and asks one of my coworkers to take it to him, but she brushes me off, and I walk out into the customer area. I have cut my hair since the Walmart incident, but I have been told that I look a lot like my mom. I guess he saw that because he sat up, and when I gave him his blizzard and began to walk away, I saw his hand drop below the table. I told my manager, and he walked around the customer area, pretending to make sure everyone's meals were all right. He came back and told me the guy's hand had moved back up to his blizzard since I'd been out there. Michigan kept coming more and more often to Dairy Queen, and always did the same when he saw me. He'd stare at me while I made his ice cream. I started hiding when I saw him come in. Finally, I grew sick of Michigan, and it broke my heart because my bosses were very nice people. But I got a new job, and I quit Dairy Queen.